Hey everyone, this is Kit from Kit's Cars. I'm here to talk about my E63 and why I bought this car. When I got this car, a lot of people asked me what the heck I was doing with such a big, large family sedan when, I'm mostly a sports car guy, but I do really appreciate big, comfy, quiet cars, and I'll talk through some of the things I really like about this one. All right, let's start with the exterior. The 2021 E63 got a little bit of a refresh. It has the new grille for a bit of family resemblance to the AMG GT coupe. This whole four-door coupe thing has gotten completely out of control, but it is what it is about today's cars market. I actually really like the front end of this car. It's a little bit softer while still remaining aggressive, and the complex sort of beady LED headlights work really well. There's plenty of cooling for the various radiators for both the coolant and the turbo intercooler fluid as well. And the parking sensors are not super obnoxious. They're decently well hidden. There are a couple things I wish Mercedes would have done better. I like the way these parking sensors here are a little bit hidden, but really, you put the front view camera not only not symmetric, but you've got this big old badge you could have hid it behind, and you didn't. So anyway, that's a little bit of a weird choice. The gloss black trim looks great. It's got a decently aggressive front lip without scraping on things. I haven't actually scraped this, which is nice. The wheel design on this car is interesting. When I saw it in the brochures, I actually really liked this wheel design, and it looks good when it's dark or contrasty, but during the day, these kind of really thick outer spoke pieces just look a little bit weird. And if you can actually see those, it makes the wheel look kind of chunky. But from a contrasty point of view, the parts that are machined actually, I think, look decent. The E63 has a pretty decently flared front fender, which I think looks great, gives it a good amount of aggression and muscularity up front. But I am kind of bummed that they tucked decently large 295 rear tires with no fender flare, so there's not as much of the aggression from the rear quarter view as I would like. The rear end of the car looks nice for the most part. I'm not sure. Some of these cars end up with chrome trim in the middle, and for a car that has the night package, which is supposed to be blacked out, there's a lot of chrome on the back of this car. I'm not sure what happened there. And this rear trunk spoiler is pretty odd. I mean, you can see from the front the cross section is fairly even, but from the back it's got these corners that kind of stick up, and it gives it kind of a strange look. I don't mind it. It's not super obnoxious, but it's not my favorite feature of the car. The rear diffuser and the exhaust tips look great to me, except for the fact that these exhaust tips don't actually connect to the exhaust pipes that come out of the car. So if you look closely, that does bother me, and I try just not to look close because that's not great. I always like black roof with the white paint. Again, you can see where the Mercedes really could have made this rear fender look much more aggressive if they had chosen to, but didn't, and it gives the car a little bit of a soft-sided look, unfortunately. Coming around to the side profile of the car, you can see that this is not a cab forward design. There's a big nose that implies rear wheel drive with the wheel tucked up in a relatively short wheelbase and long rear overhang. The front overhang is very short, but the wheel is pushed quite a bit forward in it. I think the car looks pretty good from a side profile. It's subtle and decently attractive. I do wish that like I said, the rear haunches had a little bit more fender flare to it, but for the straight side view, I think the car looks pretty good. And here again, you can see the contrast between the front fender and the rear fender. That rear fender is just not super exciting looking, where the front fender is real muscular. You can see, especially with the sunlight glinting off of it and emphasizing that curve, that the front fender is a pretty nice piece. I spent a lot of time talking about the interior of the E63, so I won't spend a ton of time on this right now, but there are some kind of interesting features. One is the emotion start. So the car normally starts up with a relatively subtle, but there's not a whole lot of theatrics to it. But if you want to be obnoxious, you can hold down the brake, hold down the shift lever, and then hit the start button. And that does an emotion start, which revs it a little higher with the valves open. Wish you could program the car to do that by default, but you can't. The steering wheel is controversial in this car in that it is pretty busy. I mean, you can see there's buttons along all these spokes. They're all smooth, touch sensitive. There's a little bit of haptic feedback on each one, but I find especially the ones where you have to scroll a little annoying, but I talked a lot about that in my previous video, so we won't spend a ton of time on it here. I did want to go down to the mode controller. So this is another one of Mercedes' redundant controls. You've got you can push it and it'll go to the individual settings, which are configurable however you want them. And then you can turn the wheel. If you turn it to the left, sorry, this is the winter slippery conditions mode. Then individual, then comfort, sport, sport plus, and race. And sport plus and race automatically open the valve controller, so you can see the exhaust. When you turn this to sport plus, it turns it on. This is probably 2 more modes than the car actually needs, because the difference between comfort and sport is pretty minor. You can see the engine goes into sport response, the dynamics go into advanced, the suspension goes into sport, but I really can't tell much of a difference between the two. And then sport plus actually opens the exhaust up, goes to dynamic, and then the sport plus suspension, which you can definitely feel a difference in terms of ride comfort and the initial reaction to bumps. All right, that's everything I wanted to go over sitting still. Let's go for a drive. This car's got great brakes. From the exterior, one of the things you will notice is that it has these beautiful large fixed 6-piston calipers up front, and then these kind of boring sliding, decently large but sliding calipers for the rear, similar to the M5 and the M8 and some other cars in the class. Not really sure why they do that, probably to keep the squeak down, but it's too bad because it looks a little bit unbalanced. Mercedes does a decent job of disguising the calipers in the back. That said, these brakes work great. They are progressive and firm. One of the things I was looking for coming out of the M8 was a more natural feeling brake pedal. BMW certainly gets props for experimenting around with a electronic brake-by-wire system in the M8, but it never quite feels natural. It feels a little bit weird, and you just have a sense of being disconnected. I'm sure they will get better, just like steering and throttle, but I remember the original drive-by-wire throttle controls were just very non-linear and funky feeling. People complained about throttle lag and non-linearity, and the brakes on the M8 felt very similar. I've never felt fade in the car. I haven't used this car on track, but I have driven it decently hard in the mountains and haven't had any brake fade. And on a car this heavy, that's this powerful, that's probably about as much of a win as you're going to get out of modern brakes. The brakes have a nice progressive feel. They're sensitive without being too touchy, and they stop the car very consistently. There's not a lot of change in the way the brake pedal reacts, which is great. And everything you'd want from that, although it's to be expected of a car of this caliber. The transmission in this car is an interesting one. Mercedes decided that dual clutch transmissions couldn't hold enough power to deal with the mighty 4-liter AMG twin turbo V8, so they built the MCT transmission. Now they've used that MCT to refer to everything from a dual clutch in the GLA 45, weird multi-clutch in this car. Well, what this car actually has is the internals of a automatic transmission. So it's a 9-speed automatic transmission, but instead of a torque converter and using viscous fluid to transfer power, it actually has a set of wet clutches, which is odd. And you'd think it would have some disadvantages, but in this case it works really well. It is actually more responsive than BMW's solution to the same problem, which was going to a traditional ZF torque converter automatic, which is a great transmission, but it doesn't respond as quickly as this, and it does leave you feeling a little more disconnected from the car than even a dual clutch transmission. This car, I think, is actually a better balance, except for a few low speed stumbles. You can confuse it if you are driving at low speeds and you roll off the throttle and roll onto it. It does get a little confused sometimes and make a little bit of a lurch or a clunk. But for the most part, this transmission works great. It's very responsive, it kicks down easily, and it feels very natural when it does so, unlike DCT transmissions in automatic mode. But it's also very responsive. Even in the base mode, it's very responsive. As soon as you click the paddles, it executes a shift. So I've been pretty pleased with this transmission. I was a little surprised. I was expecting not to like it as much. I was expecting for it to be not as smooth as the ZF 8-speed, and I expected it to be not as quick as DCT, but I actually think it's a pretty good compromise. Now, the only obvious disadvantage is that this transmission is not lightweight, and although it might actually weigh more than the ZF 8-speed, I do prefer it. I came from a BMW M8 prior to this, and the transmission in that car was good, but I definitely think this one's better. It not only is more responsive, but when you're driving slow, it does just as good a job of being smooth and unobtrusive. But we didn't buy this car for the brakes or for the transmission, really. The reason people buy AMGs is for the motor. Mercedes has this kind of odd habit of taking the same motor and sticking it in a whole bunch of different cars in varying states of trim, which I actually think is good because it gives them the ability to really develop that motor and make it reliable and powerful, which they've done a good job of with this one. It is a little odd that they have so many varying states of tune in this. In this car, it has right around 640 foot-pounds of torque. I'll look up the exact amount later, but it has 603 horsepower. And it's a hot V configuration, so it has the turbos between the cylinder heads, meaning a short exhaust path out, shorter tubing for the turbo, so you get more response and better capture of the exhaust energy because it's not traveling as far. Mercedes does a good job of tuning out the turbo. It's very responsive, so the car feels natural without surging much at middle throttle openings, but if you slam the throttle open, there's not turbo lag and feels very responsive. The kickdown response is pretty good, and I do think that this car matches with the engine really well. It feels like just a very, very large displacement engine rather than a turbo engine. You can't hear any of the spooling noises or blow-off valve or anything like that inside the car with the windows up. In race mode, the acceleration is pretty good. I'm very impressed with the car. The nice thing about this 9-speed transmission is that you do get really short gearing. A lot of cars nowadays shift to second to third right after 60 miles an hour for a better 0 to 60 time. This car actually shifts just before the 60 mark. It shifts right about 57, and which probably lengthens its 0 to 60 time a little bit, but it is pretty quick despite that. I've seen magazines test it between 2.8, 2.9 seconds to 3.1 to 60, and a tenth of that is probably in the shift there. The short gearing is nice. Third gear in this car tops out at in the mid 80s, which makes the car feel fast during that range, because it's doing an extra shift compared to a lot of cars. The M8 would shift to 60, or shift to second right after 60, and then would shift to third over 100 miles an hour. So you spent a good amount of time sitting kind of in third gear, letting the car accelerate, which feels decent, but I find that the theater of the multiple shifts in this car feel pretty good. Plus, on a twisty road, third gear feels a lot more responsive when you're in that gear. So I really like this transmission, really like this motor. It's got more mid-range punch than the M8's motor does. You can tell that from a spec sheet just by the amount of maximum, the peak torque that this car produces. It's almost 100 foot-pounds more than the M5 or the M8, but you can really feel that at 4,000 RPM, this car is pulling a lot harder. It still pulls pretty hard into redline too, although it redlines 500 RPM lower than the M8. This car, by at least my butt dyno, feels a lot faster, and the motor sounds a lot better. I really like the way this motor sounds. It's a beefy, sort of traditional sounding V8 that revs really quickly. I really enjoy the way it sounds and the way it performs. The obvious downside of having such a high performance motor and with today's gasoline is the gas mileage. When I drive a little bit like a jerk, like I am, this car does not get great gas mileage. It's probably even worse than the M8, which obviously is not the primary reason that you buy an AMG, but it is something to be aware of. I mean, I get about 15 miles to the gallon when I'm driving sort of normally, and closer to 11 when driving aggressively, and that fits in with about where the EPA thinks this car should get. But the auto start stop in this car is interesting. It's very quick in terms of being responsive, and I wouldn't mind it nearly as much as I do when it's warm outside, because when the engine shuts off, the air conditioner gets really weak. But it does start up really quickly when it does start up, and it's not very annoying in this car. Mercedes actually has a technology where they stop the motor at top dead center of one of the cylinders, trapping a little bit of pressure in it, so that when you go to restart it, it restarts much more quickly. And it does work. I think the start stop is more responsive on this car. By the time I get my foot off the brake pedal in this car, the motor's already started, so it's not nearly as annoying as I found it in other cars. If I leave the steering wheel control here in comfort mode, the car does a great job of being comfortable. And this car does have an air suspension. It does adjust the ride height with different configurations. It's pretty hard to tell. I mean, I've played with it a little bit, and it does a subtle adjustment between the comfort and race mode, and you can raise the car up with a shortcut in the center screen to gain more road clearance. And I've only used that once when I was on a dirt road, but it did work fairly well. The car rides serenely. I do notice that this car rides a lot better than the earlier E63s of this generation. The 2021 is softened to ride better. I did lower the tire pressures a little bit. The car rides really nicely over bumps. It's definitely a better ride quality difference than the M8 was. The M8 tended to crash over bumps, and it would get confused when the car was moving around. Part of that might have been the fact that switching from comfort to sport, don't really feel much difference, to tell you the truth. The ride is a little bit more brittle, not much, and then the transmission's a little more responsive, but again, not much. There's not a lot of change, and I don't really feel a need to drive it in sport mode. It doesn't even open the exhaust up. Sport Plus does make a pretty big difference. The transmission definitely holds a lower gear. It locks out, or I don't know if it actually locks out the top couple of gears, but it certainly is changing to a gear lower. The exhaust opens up and the pedal becomes more responsive. Now, all of these modes are also tunable for individuals. So you can make any combination of stiff or soft ride with the aggressive throttle mapping and aggressive transmission mapping. So you can choose what you want there, which is nice, especially given that individual is just a push of a button away. But it turns out Mercedes actually did a decent job, and my individual settings are basically exactly the same as sport. And then there's race mode. Mercedes puts all these warnings in the manual about how dire consequences occur if you try to drive the car in race mode on city streets or public roads. The stability control is supposed to be turned down. The transmission is in its most aggressive. The throttle is its most aggressive. The suspension is as stiff as it can go. And it feels just like Sport Plus to me. The manual indicates that the car actually takes a lower ride height. And one of the things that is a little bit annoying to me is it doesn't seem that I can select the exact combination of race mode in the individual mode. So if you want all the aggression of the race mode, you have to just put it in race mode, which luckily isn't too difficult to do. It's just a turn of the little wheel on the center console, but it's a little bit weird that they have an individual mode that you can't select this with. And truth be told, race mode is not all that aggressive. It's actually what I use to drive on twisty roads, because it has the right amount of damping and throttle response, and the transmission is aggressive enough without being too aggressive. I mean, you can see I'm driving in race mode right now and turning about 2,000 RPMs as I'm cruising. It's not like putting a GT3 in Sport Plus and the transmission in PDK Sport and driving it around, because that car will hold the shortest gear possible for the speed you're going, and it's very, very aggressive, but perfect on a racetrack. This might do, on a racetrack, if you're being fully aggressive, might do something similar, but it's not too aggressive to drive around on normal streets on, and I don't feel like the additional leeway the traction control gives you is all that much or dangerous on city streets. It's more theater than anything else. So yeah, props on Mercedes for giving you as many choices. There's 6 driving modes that you can choose, including the individual that you can configure. But at the end of the day, I really only use 2 of them, which are the full all-out race mode and then the comfort mode. So it's a little bit sad that they went to all that effort of creating the different modes, but maybe one of the other modes is Goldilocks for someone else. For me, I leave it in comfort when I'm driving normally, and when I want to do something a little spicy, then I'll toss it in race mode, which isn't really much of a race mode, so. All right, let's put the car in race mode and go up some twisty roads. Certainly race mode, the suspension gets a little more crashy. You can feel it over bumps, but there's also controls body roll really well. The air suspension does tighten up quite a bit and makes the car feel more agile than a large sedan like this should. Power is very usable coming out of corners. Has the traction of all-wheel drive. Certainly the car feels heavy in transitions like that. There's a little bit of, I guess, chassis lag from the weight transferring going back and forth, but overall it feels pretty good on a twisty road. One of the reasons that I actually went looking for a different car was the performance of the M8 on a twisty road is not all that fun. And, part of that could have been due to the fact it was a convertible and it had a more flexy chassis, but this car, surprisingly, and one of the things that the Mercedes have never really been known for is the handling prowess, but I think this car does pretty well on a twisty road. In fact, better than the M5 or M8, in my opinion. The It has more ride comfort when in comfort mode, and is aggressive with the damping in the race mode, but it doesn't crash over bumps nearly as much as the M8, and it damps the bigger movements better and more completely. The M8 found itself getting out of sorts. The other thing this car has is really good steering. It doesn't have a ton of feel coming through the helm. You know, look, it's not my 718 Spyder or my McLaren 600 LT. There's no comparison to the steering of a sports car compared to that of a big old luxury sedan. But the steering is very accurate and true. It feels like the wheels are doing exactly what you asked them to and nothing more. The M8 had a very disconnected feeling tiller, and when you turn the wheel, you never really know what you were going to get. And sometimes the wheel you could feel the car was slipping or doing something you didn't want it to, and you just didn't have a whole lot of control over that, which I didn't like. This car definitely feels like it handles better in turns. You've got more control, and the steering is much more accurate. The motor sounds great during these just running through the mid-range there. The brakes feel strong and consistent. The paddles are very responsive to your input, and the gearing is perfect for a twisty road, even one as tight and twisty as this one that I'm on right now. The car is certainly stiff. There's not a ton of body roll due to being in the race mode. The turn-in is kind of what you expect from a big sedan. It's decent, but certainly you're not going to mistake it for a sports car. Transition response, as I said earlier, was decent for a car of this size, but certainly you'd caveat it with the fact that it's a big car. You're not going to mistake this thing for a sports car in a quick transition or in a twisty road. The traction control is not all that permissive. You can't really slide the car around in race mode, maybe a little bit, but the car does not really like to be slid around. It certainly will let you make mistakes, though, more so than a lot of cars of this size. And overall, it's if you don't mind it being a little bit fat, it is fun to drive on a twisty road. It's responsive, and the motor is great. The brakes are great. The steering is okay. Suspension is decent. Overall, it certainly does its job. Even though the car doesn't embarrass itself on a twisty road, it's not its primary mission, and probably not the thing it's best at. The best thing it can do is eating up large amounts of miles in comfort and in style and in speed. But it's not bad on a twisty road. It's really not bad. I think it's the best in its class in this kind of environment. The M5, I don't think the M5 suspension is as sorted, although if you really like sliding around, the M5, both these cars have a drift mode, but the M5 seems a bit happier using it. And the RS6 just feels larger. It's a heavier car than this, and the suspension is not as well sorted to me. It's both crashier and floatier than the M5 or E63. And right now, there's not a whole lot of other competition. I'm certainly interested to see how Cadillac's CTS 5V comes out with the black Stone. I'll figure it out later. Anyway, the Cadillac should be pretty interesting in this class. The magnetic dampers that Cadillac uses tend to produce a really good balance between ride comfort and ride control. Possibly better than this car, so I'm really anxious to drive that when it comes out. Prior to having this car, I owned a couple of Teslas too. I had a pre-Raven P100D and I had a Model 3 Performance. And neither of those cars do as well on a twisty road as this car. Both of them have floppier suspensions that weren't so much fun. Now, I haven't driven a Raven or Plaid Model S, but given their weight, I doubt they're as good as this car on a twisty road. Certainly, the newer Plaid cars are going to be faster in a straight line, but I'd be surprised if the suspension was even close to as good. But there's only one way to find out, so I'm going to try to go drive one and see. Well, hopefully you'll see some of the justification for me getting such a contrasting large daily driver to the 718. This car does a great job in its primary mission of delivering comfort and speed to the occupants. It is a very comfortable car. It's quiet, it's really composed, has a nice interior. It's a really nice place to eat up miles. And it doesn't embarrass itself on a twisty road, so it's hard to complain about, except for the gas mileage and possibly the price and weight. So that's my review. I think this is a great car. I think it's the best one in the segment. So love to hear what you think in the comments. Thanks.